The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the 15th out of 16 collections of entries from website subscribers for the 2021 Orchestration Challenge. This is an exciting bunch of scores, and I'm just going to jump straight into it with John's entry right here. So we just listened to that mock-up here in this video, and the first thing that sort of strikes me, John, is that I think that you did yourself a little bit of a disservice in leaving out a lot of the sort of bounciness right here at the beginning. So you can sort of hear it in the mock-up that everything is sort of feels a little stodgy. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't really leap off of the page. It has this kind of almost of course it has a slower tempo. And I'm wondering if you marked this at 120 because I had marked dotted half note at 60 as being a recommended tempo in the template. So the thing about that is that if you are going to change that into quarter notes instead of half notes, then it has to be 180 quarter notes per minute, right? So, and 120 showed up in a lot of entries. So I'm wondering if this is just a thing that people sort of like thought, okay, well, there was the application that I'm using is not interpreting Thomas's template. The template tempo the correct way, so I'm going to do this as quarter note equals 120, when rather it should be quarter note equals 180 to get it up to that same speed of dotted half note equals 60. All right, so I won't go into it for too long, but I was just wondering about that if people are running into that problem. But the main thing is that there's not as much punch, right, as in the piano version, right? There's that in the piano version. There's this really crisp yum 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 yum, right? And here you've got staccato on your second violins, but not on your first violins. And there's this strange tie, like you're tying the top pitch. And I'm noticing that this shows up in some other places, right? What seems a little bit here again, right? So those ties, like, they don't really make any sense. You can't really have a tie and a grace note, right? And it doesn't really make sense to tie the top pitch and not the lower pitch. So it is possible to play that, but it just doesn't. And once again, like this right here, so it's sort of a non sequitur. This the idea of tying these together when it's so vigorous. Now, some general comments about your orchestration approach here. This is kind of one of the harder things to evaluate to be completely honest about it, because you have so many different approaches, and that's a good thing, by the way. You are keeping me on my toes by forcing me through that, and that's fine. It's just that, that it's, is there a sense of continuity across the board, or is it just a series of different orchestration approaches, one after the other, right? So that's the first thing to think about. And then, just in general, talking about like not really using the articulations from the score. We're not having like accents or staccatos, so the music kind of has this. As I was saying before, it just feels a little kind of slow and stodgy, right? Now, I don't mean to say that your music sounds stodgy at all. It sounds really lovely, but the lack of kind of a kick on these first few notes. It sort of robs a little bit of the excitement from the score. Now, there's just a few instrumentation things. Timpani does not have unlimited pitches. Some timpanists are really good changing the pitches of the kettles on the fly, but you really have asked, I think, for too many different pitches in a row, right? So we have a D, and then an F, and then a G sharp, and an A, and a B, and a C. So it's really that's 5 or 6 different pitches, right? So it's just a lot to be asking the timpanist to change. Like, for instance, here they could have a C, an A, and a B on 3 different kettles, and they could hold on to the B and retune, or they could change the C to a B and then retune some of the other things. But this would actually, to play this, would require an extra kettle of a lower pitch. Well, I mean, is that true? Yeah, it would. If you were to play each note on a separate kettle. But of course, a lot of timpanists can do things like they could change the B to an A and then get this on the 2 lower kettles and get that on the upper kettle, right? So they do have the ability to to change things around, but it's still just a very, it's very, very, it's just a lot of tuning changes. And then here, you sort of walk down to E and so on. So you really are using the kettles to do a lot of pitches. And and there's kind of, you mark it pianissimo at the beginning, and then there are no further changes, no matter what else the music is doing, right? So, like right in here, for instance, the music is getting louder, but the timpani is still soft. It still thinks it's pianissimo from before, right? Okay, so now I'm going to apply the website entrant evaluation criteria. So, the first quandary, the first thing that we have to watch out about taking the music from the piano score and turning it into an orchestral piece is there's a concern about using exactly the same group of pitches, which are all sort of centered around the upper part of the treble staff in the piano, and then they get slightly bigger and so on. And you have spread things around, and that's really, really great. So you've checked that box, right? Then the next concern is thematic material repeats often in the piano score, possibly sounding repetitive if orchestrated the same way throughout. You also tick that box really nicely. You don't orchestrate everything exactly the same way throughout, right? So let's take a look at how the first 4 bars are orchestrated, and then how the kind of you think of this as A1, how is A2 orchestrated, right? So as I said before, this just really needs more punch, right? This needs to the notes sort of need to flick off of the player's embouchure, just brimp, brimp, brimp. I have to, they have to just. It's almost like they're throwing away the notes. It's like the notes are little droplets on their fingertips, and they're flicking them off. Now here, this is a bit of a non sequitur. You have tied or slurred grace notes that are the same pitch, right? So do you intend the piccolo player to go da-da, 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 or do you intend them to go da, 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 right? Da, 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 where my snap is the downbeat or is the on beat. The problem with doing it the second way is that you're basically telling one player to come in slightly early compared to everybody else, right? And that's just the general effect. Now, if you really intend for two separately articulated notes, that's fine. It's just it's not as powerful as like slurring up or slurring down to that pitch. Now, the way that this starts off being scored, it's kind of fun. You got flute and A2 clarinets in octaves. I'm kind of not sure why you didn't have A2 flutes. You could have easily scored this for triple winds all the way through. Two flutes plus piccolo, two oboes plus English horn, two clarinets plus bass clarinet. You could have had more flutes, but it's all right that you're putting some limitations on yourself. That's fine. I do that from time to time in these challenges as well. One thing, I'm wondering if this is MuseScore, because that's something I'm seeing a lot in MuseScore is disconnected bar lines, right? Where like whatever the bracket is on the left hand side should be the same length as the bar line for all of the pieces. Now, but speaking of bar lines, it's really unnecessary in a concert score like this to mark every single the number of every single bar. But that could have been the format. I understand if you're new to this, it's totally fine, John. But yeah, you don't really need to mark the number of every bar in a concert score. That's more of a film score or commercial score kind of a thing. Okay, so yum 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 yum, and I just love this little kind of reaction, bringing in the brass softly, which is a great idea, right? Like let the other players continue to be loud, and then just have the brass sort of back it up a little. I would say the trombone should also be soft. In general, that's another sort of problem with your scoring, is that you have really inconsistent dynamic markings. Like very rarely is the entire orchestra playing the same dynamic. Like for instance, here you've got forte winds across the board and forte strings. Now by the third bar, you've got piano oboes right in here, and for some strange reason the stems are pointing the wrong direction. So we've got piano oboes, but everybody else is still playing loudly. And here you have loud trombones, but the rest of the brass section is playing loudly, or playing softly. And then here you have, so I'm not sure about this divisi piano. So is this supposed to be piano or is this supposed to be piano? I can't tell. So usually the unless there are two separate voices, the dynamic marking should go below the notes rather than above them, right? So you just have like a lot of mixing around of different dynamic levels, and it just as you can hear in the mock-up, it makes a lot of the voices very difficult to hear. It really works better if there is more or less a homogeneous approach to the dynamics, and the scoring itself of stronger and gentler registers helps to sort of mix the music and put it in the right context and the right balance, right? So that's the strongest way to do it, is that the music just naturally balances. Say every instrument is in its strongest register, or the instruments that have a tendency to play out a little are in a weaker register, right? So like that would be the case for that would be, for instance, scoring trumpets lower, right? Or horns lower. Okay, so there's kind of a strange thing going on here, and I'm sure everybody could hear it in the mock-up, that the clarinets seem to be out of tune here, or out of pitch. So, normally I would say, well, you're trying to do something cool with the harmony here, like you're trying to harmonize at a fourth or so, or something like that, like this being B and that being like you're sort of playing in fourths, but it kind of doesn't agree, like with the music going forward. So I'm wondering if you had been scoring transposed and you just like got the notes wrong, got the pitches wrong in here. Yeah. So let's not get into that too much. Let's talk about the mirror image of this scoring right in here. Okay, and that is over here, bars 9 through 12, right? And I really love this ya-da-da-da-dum. That's really kind of a cool idea. And then the clarinet right in here, there's little counter melodies. I think that they strengthen the music. Yeah, but once again, like the overall approach is just sort of shifting from one instrument to the other, and not really like settling on any particular strategy that is all that strong for very long, right? So it makes it really difficult for me to analyze, because it's hard to get a handle on anything, because like nothing is really holding on for too long. So like right in here, I would say like the brass are going to have a tendency to outplay the strings, but it's still not a huge problem. I think you're missing. I think you mean to go piano crescendo to forte on your timpani as well, right? Right in here. So I'll just assume that that is the case. So, if that is the case, then the strings really need to stay strong, and the handoff needs to feel a little bit more natural right in here. And part of that is done by handing off pitches that are balanced dynamically and also overlap on the same pitch, rather than like you've got a case here where you've got the E fifth and the oboes being being 1 octave higher than the horns, right? So you can't really trade off from your horns to your oboes, because this would actually balance mezzo forte to forte oboes. That would be a good balance. Mezzo forte horns to forte oboes. Even mezzo piano would be even better. But it could balance, except for the fact that they're so far apart in pitch. They're an octave apart, right? So I can understand what you're doing with some of these things, but try to have handoffs go to the same pitch and sort of be balanced dynamically. So like forte for the brass is generally fortissimo for the strings, right? And for the winds. So it's that kind of thing. All right, now let's take a look at the other concern. Melodic development soaring quite high, accompaniment figures covering a wide range in our sort of B1 and B2 sections. So that would be like bars 5 to 8 and bars 13 to 16. And this is interesting. You start the flute right on the downbeat. You could actually dovetail right here. Have the flute come in right here on the third beat. Dun, 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 dun. And then piccolo. Bum, 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 bum. And I thought this was interesting. Like you end pizzicato. So you don't really need to mark staccato under pizzicato, because it is already a staccato-like sound, right? So it's sort of overkill. Like staccato on pizzicato should only happen when you're really specifically trying to get an extra dry sound, and it's something where everybody's really paying attention to the way the pizzicato is being played. But this is kind of just more thematic, right? It's just something thrown in there. So there's no time to really make those kinds of niceties, right? So just get rid of the staccato. This is really cool. See, like the whole thing here with the throwing in the timpani, playing, doubling this pizzicato line. You could just have the timpani doubling a couple of pitches, but just have the main pizzicato happening in the cellos. Yeah, and once again, it's sort of confusing the way that it's scored in terms of the dynamics and so on, and the phrasing. So I would say, just in general, the treatment of the melodic line here is kind of fun, actually. But it's sort of interesting that you're using your first violins to sort of play the pattern, and then you kind of have the pattern drop to your lower strings, and a touch of bassoon in there, and then it kind of, it just feels a little scattershot. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of spread out, and there's just kind of little bits and pieces here and there in different parts. So I think that like a more coherent approach with just really like having this approach in an instrument, a specific instrument, say whether it was clarinets or some other kind of thing. Let's say that like you didn't really intend to do this for the clarinet. So if the clarinets were playing this pattern for 2 or 4 bars or something like that, then that might be better than just like having a little bit of it there and there and there and there. See, look, because the problem is that like the motive, the energy, when it keeps being repositioned in different areas like this without a lot of follow through or trading off or calculation, it has a tendency to sort of just kind of pull the rug out from under the momentum of the passage, right? And then, right in here, this is actually really nice. This da 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 da. That's sort of you've got. I like the way that you deal with this right in here. The problem though is that we're not really seeing that really important melody. Da 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 da. Right, it's sort of absent from this. So you've got a little bit of it in the cellos, right? But it doesn't really emerge in a way where we can really hear the melody start. And then da 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 da. See, so just the melody is suddenly incredibly powerful, right? So there isn't kind of a follow through. There isn't melodic continuity as strongly, right? So I feel that that's something that is holding you back there. I think that the melody could have been, could have had more, just had been more of a constant throughout these 4 bars. But I mean, having said this, I'm being very critical of your score, John, but don't take any of this personally because, what you did do here just sounds really fascinating. I mean, you changed things around so much, and apologies to the music cutting off. It actually cuts off dead, right, I think, on the second beat in your mock-up that you sent me. It just sort of suddenly cuts off, so I sort of faded it out very quickly so that it wouldn't sound so much like that. Or maybe it's right here, it cuts off. Anyway, so right around here, I think that the music starts to pick up in a really interesting way. So once again, I don't understand. You have this contrary motion in bassoon. Why is the bassoon soft? Right? And I can't remember what the double bass was before, but shouldn't it get a marking of forte as well? So just we're really sure what the dynamic is right here. And then also here, piano crescendo to what, right? What's the dynamic here? So if we're going to forte crescendo and ending up at fortissimo, shouldn't the horns be nice and loud here? So I guess you've got forte. So forte, yeah, so it's just a little, it's just a little unclear the way you've scored this. And this is kind of interesting that the piccolo starts very low, where it's kind of hard to hear, and then it doesn't play the finishing note, right? So essentially right here, it's doubling the flute. Whereas you could have had it an octave higher and going all the way up to that high E, which is the same E that's in the piano score, right? So there's a lot more that you could do to this. You could have had a triple octave with oboes and clarinets on the bottom, flute in the middle, and piccolo on top, and gone all the way up to that very, very high E. Right? And then here, are you sure that you want your first violins to end on the 5th of the chord rather than just the octave? Couldn't you run up to an E here and double the flutes, sort of strengthen that line? All right, now this is actually cool. I like the fact that you drop down to this E, 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 and then trading off ba-da-da-da-dun, bum-bum-bum-bum-bum, da-da-da-dum. So I really like that trading off between the different instruments. I think that's very, very cool. And then you're going to this molto marcato part. And, you have this thing happening in the oboes and the clarinets. That's kind of fun, right? So it's kind of an offbeat pacing that's not really that's not tied so much to the downbeat, right? Which makes it sound very almost like, I don't want to say the word pedestrian, but it just really sounds very, very paced and measured, right? So I feel like you really reached out with a lot of different approaches and different different ideas for different little bits and pieces of passages. But I'm just wondering whether or not ultimately, your effort here would have been stronger if you had stayed with the notes that were supplied in the piano part and then built from them. And so anything that was added to it, like for instance, this bass line or just the harmonization in the brass and so on. So anything that was added to it strengthened the material that was in the piano score rather than competed with it, right? So I feel that that's one of the problems with the approach here is that the new material that you add tends to lessen the impact of the material that is transcribed from the score. And there are a lot of things that I kind of don't understand, like why did the first violins come to an end here, for instance, right? Why is there just there's a crescendo here, then here you have forte diminuendo. So why aren't the dynamics uniform and so on? So don't get me wrong. I mean, I really love the fact that you add things to it and then you come up with these really interesting textures. But I think that those textures and those approaches being used to strengthen the original ideas of Falla would make this a stellar effort, right? Would just really be eye-poppingly great. So I think you get a total A for creativity and imagination with this, right? So just like I would just say, maybe in the next orchestration challenge, if you give it a try, just think about those elements that are really crucial to the musical idea, and how to use alternate supporting ideas and concepts and approaches in a way that just like really makes them strong while making your score different, right? And that was one of the things that was so delightful about this, is just how different it was from all the other scores, right? It just had its own unique sound. So thank you so much for that, John. I really enjoyed this score, and I hope you don't feel I was beating up on you there. Sometimes that gets lost in all of the little suggestions and feedback and so on. That I really do. I mean, I've yet to run into a dud score, right? I've looked at every single score now of all 165 entries. And, there isn't a single score where people didn't really try their hardest and, work with what they had to put their best effort, right? So I really appreciate that. I'm not dissing this at all, but just some suggestions about building on your obvious talent towards something even stronger in your scoring, okay? All right, so on to the next entry. I really like this, Ulrich. There are some things that are kind of not possible here. Sibelius is telling you that they're not possible, and Sibelius is right. But we'll talk about those things as we go. Okay, just my general impression here. I really like the ambition of the scoring, the scope of it. It's so huge. I don't even have to go over the evaluation criteria to tell you that the whole concern of the pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano is null and void, because you are, just really stretching out your sound picture. I think that's wonderful. I like the experimentation here that you got with the harps. I think that all of this is workable in the sound picture as you've asked for it. I think that these roll marks, however, they're a little unnecessary. I think that you need, I think all you need here is just a standard roll marks. The up pointing arrow is only necessary when there is a down pointing arrow somewhere. Since there are no downward pointing arrows anywhere in your score, it is absolutely unnecessary for you to use the upward pointing arrow. Okay, just use the standard roll mark. That's the default. All right, everybody, please don't use the up arrow unless there is a down arrow somewhere, okay? Because some players will look for the down arrow in their part, right? It's just wasting their time. Just use the standard default roll mark, okay? All right, and then the whole question here is like, are you rolling an octave, or is this at pizzicato, is this actually like a grace note rather? Bum bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Yeah, so I don't know. I would just as soon see this expressed as grace notes. But as far as that's concerned, like, you could just leave out any kind of grace note or any kind of roll mark, and then you would still get the like if the player were just to use their finger to sort of pluck across the string, then you would sort of get a little bit of this effect anyways. I think all you need to do is just put it the first time and then don't mention it anywhere else, right? And just do it as a standard roll mark. And then the player will get it. They don't have to have it spelled out every single time they do it. Okay? All right, now, just a quick check-in here with the harp. If you intend for this to last for 3 beats, just write a 3-beat note, right? You don't need to have these incomplete, these incomplete ties. Just tell us how long you want the note to be. Tell the harpist how long you want the note to be. It's fine. And I think that this will work fine, except like the thing that you have to remember about glissando in intervals is that as these strings are vibrating as you go up, and then the notes, the fingers that come underneath will hit those strings again, and then especially with a chord, it'll hit it a third time. So there's a bit of buzzing and there's a bit of indeterminate pitch to a rolled chord, especially since it's hard for the player to get it exactly parallel going all the way up because of the change of there's a slight change of orientation of the hand and the wrist and everything else as they pull upwards. So you would probably have the harpist doing this glissando two-handed, right? One hand will do the thirds and the other hand will do the note at the octave below. And I mean, I think it all works together. It's really kind of fun, just this big, huge roll. And I think that those things all work. You need to sort of divide up the orientation of you should decide, obviously, since this is going to be covered with 2 hands, like where do the hands divide the different, and that actually helps in the reading, right? Like, for instance, right here, you have 2, D minor over C chords, right? So if you have one on a stem pointing down and the other one on a stem pointing up, then it's much, much easier to read for the harpist. And it's the same thing here, Okay, so let's jump straight in. This is actually my second crack at evaluating your score, Ulrich, because the first time there was a power outage. So and you think that how often does that happen? Well, considering how I have recorded about 100 hours of evaluations just over the past 10 weeks, it was bound to eventually happen, right? Okay, so just kind of looking at the way things are scored, applying the rest of the evaluation criteria, we've got the concern about thematic material repeating often, possibly sounding repetitive if orchestrated exactly the same way throughout. So like this being the same as this being the same as this, right? Now, it isn't exactly the same. You make a couple of changes here and there, but, like for instance in here, but essentially it's the same thing, right? Sibelius just really needs to get it together on how it stacks first and second voice notes and grace notes. That's one of the things that is still a problem, and it should have been fixed in version 2. Okay, come on, everybody. Everybody working over at Sibelius, fix this problem now and forever, rather than having that fix. I know that there's a fix that the that the user can do, but it should not ever even be an issue to begin with, right? And I know it's in the math, but just fix it, all right? Okay, so so that is just something for you to think about. Whether or not you want these 4 bars to be the same as these 4 bars, however cleverly scored, right? Is it just going to feel like you're coming back to the same thing again? Well, of course, that is very, very hugely impressive the way that you have scored this, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just up to your own sense of judgment, right? Okay, so looking at how it is scored, trumpets working together, basically playing a version of the chord an octave lower, and then pizzicato, rolled pizzicato above, and the winds kind of hammering away at the same thing an octave higher. It's all fine. There's just one little thing just to kind of quickly bring up. Do you really want to go bb 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 bb? Right? Do you want that? Do you want these notes to be? Do you want your grace note to be going to the same note? I mean, it's different when you can slur to it, right? But can other notes handle that B? Like, for instance, here you got the piccolo playing that same grace note, but slurring up to a B. So maybe you don't even need it in your flute playing, right? It's just like, it doesn't have to be everywhere. Same thing with the clarinet, like the E flat clarinet, which is essentially playing that same exact note. I like the use of the E flat clarinet. Okay, I think that it works really great in here. It's really great the way you pull back to piano. Bam, 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 dun 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 dun, bam, 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 dun 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 dun, bam, bum 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 bum. I love that idea, like pulling things back. And then just like the roll going into the roll, and then you get the rolled chord and the glissando coming off of it. That's such a cool idea. Just very, very, it's like a big, almost like a whip of a gesture, right? Going from here to there, and then starting with this roll, and then ending up here, and so on, and then ending up with that roll, and yeah, it's just so much fun. And then the roll coming back. So it's kind of essentially the same thing again. So let's just go straight into the next set of criteria, and that is the melodic development soaring quite high, and the accompaniment figures covering a wide range of pitches if they were to be scored in the wind instruments, and so on. So you are extremely generous in terms of scoring across your strings, pizzicato and arco, of the accompaniment figure. I think that's great. And then you've got some of those same pitches doubled in bassoons, A clarinet, and it's cool that you're using A clarinet because, I mean, after all, this is in like A and E Phrygian with a raised major third. So yeah, so it makes perfect sense to be scoring in with an A clarinet. You end up with a lot of naturals, right? You probably just even get rid of the key signature here. So the accompaniment being scored across so many instruments is very, very cool, but you are not stingy with scoring the melodic accompaniment either, right? So let's talk about that. So I can do that before I turn the page. I think it's perfect the way that the flutes are working together. Sending up your first flute up to the high D and C, it's perfectly possible for any good first flute player in a pro orchestra. So, those notes will be fine. It's a little, the top D is a little squeezed, right? You would think, oh, it must be so brilliant, nice and bright and loud, that just that top D, and it's it's almost as if as you get above C, it's almost like starts to get narrower and narrower, and then you get your player to play a high E, and it's almost just like it's shutting down. It's very similar to sending an oboe player too high, right? And same thing, like have a piccolo player play a high D for you. Like it starts to disappear. Something about it doesn't get shriekier necessarily. It just starts to kind of get almost choked off. So So you're sending these people up here to these high Ds, and that is fine for them, and it is also going to be fine for your first violin, although it'll be a little squeaky sounding, right? There'll be like an element, like the you're just getting down to 2 or 3 inches there of string length. So it just naturally at fortissimo, crescendo to fortissimo, it's going to have a kind of a squeaky sound, but it's still all right because you've got the doubling from the flute family here. One thing I would say here, just in general, like you were having your second flute player double the second oboe player in here, and your A clarinet player, and so on, and those players are going to be so much more powerful than your first flute as to almost make it completely unnecessary. Excuse me, the second flute they're going to be so much more powerful than the second flute as to make it almost completely unnecessary for the second flute to be playing. So you would be better off having your second flute player doubling your first flute for all intents and purposes here. Now, here's where you get into trouble. Sending your E-flat clarinet player all the way up there. Right? So, can your E-flat clarinet player actually get all the way up to, a written B? So, the answer is, I would say there are some E-flat clarinet players that can actually play all the way up to a written C. However, those players are far and few between, and it's just better not to chance it. I would say either just leave the note out or have the player play an octave lower on these 2 notes and then have them leap up here to this F. That's what I would do. It's just, the player that... The whole thing about the E-flat clarinet is that it's almost a con, right? It's almost a shell game. It's, what makes the E-flat clarinet sound high and piping is not so much the fact that it can go high, but it is the fact that it has got a very short bore and a narrower bore than a B-flat clarinet. So that it makes the sound thin out and sound higher than it actually is. So you can have the same few notes played by the B-flat clarinet and by the E-flat clarinet, and the listener will think, oh, well, when that little guy played it, when the smaller instrument played it, it sounded higher, right? So it's the quality of highness rather than the actual notes. Some clarinet players, like who play a lot of auxiliaries, feel that they can go just as high as an E-flat clarinet with their B-flat clarinet, like usable range. So that the reason for using the E-flat clarinet is to get a certain quality of sound, right? So you are already getting that, and you have a lot of doubling, right? You've got doubling with the oboe here, and you got doubling with the flute family, and so on and so forth. So there's absolutely no reason why, and of course the first violins, there's kind of no reason why you have to throw in these top 2 notes, right? So you could just leave them out or play them an octave lower. And then, of course, you've got trumpet, that is all fine, right? Now, let's turn the page. And we get to going all the way up to this high E. So, what was I just saying about the flute kind of getting narrower and narrower and narrower until like incredibly high notes that are kind of off the scale are just not playable. So this is one of them, right? Going all the way up to high E. High C, high D, good players, they can handle that. But at this point, you should drop an octave. And then let the overtones from your first and second flute do the work of convincing the listener that you doubled that last E. That might be a better way to do it. Or you could even drop down from this A and jump down to the B. Right? And then just once again, these overtones would reinforce the piccolo part. And of course, you've already got doubling there with the first violins. Yeah, and just some similar comments about the just very quickly. I like how generous you are with the accompaniment here. I think that works fine. It works fine with arco and everything else. So let's not dwell on that. Let's go back to the melody. Here you got E flat clarinet doubling your flute family and the first violins, and then you start bringing in lower elements. And there's like zero reason for your second flute player to be playing an octave lower than the first flute and piccolo. Second flute player is going to be very weak in here. It's not going to be really audible until around E or F. So, why not just have it doubling your flute part and then dropping here and then dropping the first flute part. So yeah, so A2, then second flute jumps down to the octave, and then first flute jumps down to double right in there. And then I think you'd get a perfectly smooth compromise inside the line that's rushing upwards and doesn't appear to have any compromises in it, right? And the same thing when you get here, like this is speaking some truth to you here. These hot red, very, very, or bright red notes here, they should really be an octave lower. I would say drop your E flat clarinet down by this note here. Try not to have everything drop at the same time, right? So if you're going to drop down to here with your flutes, maybe come in or like drop one or two notes later or earlier with your E flat clarinet. Yeah, but try not to push it all the way up to this insanely high pitch here. This is fine for the clarinets. There shouldn't be any problem going up to that high B. Okay. And, I love the idea of the timpani just pushing through here. Yeah. If there's one thing that I would critique here, and that is that you just don't have enough support on the viola line, right? You've got all these other instruments doubling and so on. Like, who do you have doubling your viola line? The humble cor anglais, right? So maybe you could spare one of your clarinet players. Like they could, second clarinet could play. Maybe you could have a bassoon player double this line, right? Although I don't know about screaming all the way up to that high E. I guess the average bassoonist could do that with no problem. It might be kind of fun. But anyways, I think you just need a little bit more weight on your viola line so that it doesn't get swallowed by the timpani down here. Okay, now here we get to the meat. What I feel is the meat of the arrangement. Just so much fun. This, your big brass chorale in here, and I feel that this all works really, really great. With your trumpets working together in octaves and so on, and then taking over the trombone when it gets too low. That's all great. And then this punch, and then coming back to you, and then yeah, I think that's all nicely scored. Just very simple and direct, and it works great. So yeah, so that's my evaluation. I'm glad that I got it right the second time, Ulrich, and the electrical system didn't break down here in New Zealand like it did on that day. It was a stormy day when I first tried to record this, and actually at that point I just kind of just said, oh, just forget about this. I'll just do it a week or two later. So that's what I'm doing. Anyways, really enjoyable. Thank you so much. And now on to the next evaluation. That is such an awesome score, Eduardo. I just love everything about it. The vibra-slap at the end, the interrelationships of the parts, just such a really fun entry. So let's jump straight into it. I'm feeling very energized after the last evaluation in this collection. So I actually took a quick break, and now my desk is not what it should be, so let me quickly put things back where they belong. All right. So, you're probably expecting this if you've been watching some of my other evaluations over the past couple months. But yes, the harp as scored right here is kind of inaudible. Like, if you were to bring everybody's volume way down, I'm talking down to piano, right? If you had just a big cliff right here, if you're falling off the cliff of dynamics and immediately going to piano, then a forte harp would have a chance here to be heard. But I think that you shouldn't do that. I think you've set everything up to be sort of, forte, fortissimo, forte, fortissimo, forte. So look, what you really want here is you want the sense of like a kind of plucking, right? So I would say it would be better for you to interpret this with pizzicato violins, right? Pluck, 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 pluck. And of course, like, it's sort of strange. I don't know why this turned out to be C flat. I see. So, like, maybe you're trying to avoid. I see what's going on here. So you're trying to avoid kind of duplicating the note and so on. But that really kind of won't make a difference. I mean, the C flat will be slightly more resonant than the B, but in the long run, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. You're trying to avoid repeating the B. So look, just interpret this as pizzicato, I would say, because there's just no way the harp is going to have much of a role in here, and you can hear it in the mock-up too, right? Like, where's the harp? It's just barely there, and that's the best you can hope for in a situation with the with orchestra. Now, this big, like, if this were a big rolled chord, and I mean adding more notes to it and just really rolling it across this first beat and marking it fortissimo, I think that you'd have a little bit of a chance of harp being heard there and there. But, like, seeing as how you also have brass, like heavy brass and horns going kapow here and so on, I think that the brass itself will also absorb whatever's going on the harp. So at the most, you'll hear kind of the tiny flutter of a roll, but it's really not going to make a lot of difference. I really do. I love this da kind of glissando here from your trombones. Yeah, really, really fun. Okay, so then one last little kind of, this is kind of a picky issue with me. Do not mark the upward pointing roll, okay, unless you have a downward pointing roll somewhere. So no downward pointing rolls, then don't worry about putting in an upward pointing roll. The upward pointing roll is saying, hey, there's going to be a downward pointing roll, so you're going to have to, so this one goes up and the next one goes down. So you don't have anything like that. So the default, right? Just the default is up anyways. So you're just complicating things. You are writing something in here that will make the player say, oh, well, where's the downward roll? And then they'll look over their part and they won't see one, and they'll just roll their eyes and say, oh, yeah, all right. Okay, whatever. So look, just put in the default roll line with no arrow on it. If this is all you're going to be rolling during this piece, right? Okay. So, now let's talk about the evaluation criteria. Now, we've gotten around the problem of the pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano. In the piano score, you have big, beautiful, generous scoring, so that's not a problem. The thematic material repeats quite often, sounding repetitive if orchestrated the same way throughout these 8 bars. But that, once again, that is not a problem because you are orchestrating 2 separate ways, right? And that's awesome. And this is a beautiful, right here, this is a beautiful progression of this texture. It works so well. Like, first you have like scorching trumpets, and then here you have blazing strings and winds. And I think that works together so well. Okay. So let's take apart some of the orchestration of this of these 2 beginning bars, and then the mirror over here. So here you've got oboes playing in unison with trumpets. So you're saying 3 trumpets in C. So how are you arranging this? Is that first and second trumpet? Or is it like you only use 2 trumpets throughout this piece? So maybe you just mean 2 trumpets in C here. And it's very easy to like retype this in Sibelius. You just click on it twice and then you can just rewrite. So if that's what you intend, right, then it's very, very easy to fix. But, you could also score it like this, right? You could have the, you could have the weight of the second and third below, and then the first above, and it's almost double, right? The projection is almost double an octave higher as it is, so doubling on the lower note will really make it stand out, except that sort of further overwhelms the oboes. So I think if you were going to score like this, have double trumpets on the bottom line, you should have A2 oboes on top. So that gives a really beautiful hard sound of the A2 oboe sound, and then combine that with the trumpet, and then you've got something beautiful that won't crack up there, unless the trumpet player cracks, right? Or unless the one of the oboe players has a bad reed. Now, you're going fairly high here, like up to C, but I still think it's worth it for like a good first trumpet player. I think that's all doable. It's no problem at all. So that's your melody. Continuing on here, bum 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 bum, an English horn doubling the lower line, along with A2 clarinets and A2 flutes above on the upper line. And then just, a overwhelming push there on that second beat. So that all works great. Okay. And the positioning of the brass, the horns below, and the English horn and clarinets and so on. The English horn and the clarinets are pretty much going to get swallowed up by what the brass is doing here, but don't take them out, right? Just leave them the way they are. The bass clarinet is awesome, though, doubling the bass trombone. It'll just give it a little bit more body. It won't be all that loud, but, if you were to score the bass clarinet up to fortissimo, then you would have a good balance with the bass trombone, is all I'm saying. And, why do you have sforzando brass here, forte sforzando brass, and all you got here is forte strings? Why is that? Well, you don't think the pizzicato should be loud enough, right? It needs to be loud. Fortissimo, please, on all of this, right? So fortissimo, there needs to be some attempt to balance this, right? So, yeah, and the same thing here, like fortissimo, sforzando, this just really has to be loud. A big snap on that open, the open D string. Yeah, right there. It'll be very effective. Okay. And then here, this is kind of fun because, like, if you do these 4 bars differently the second time, then you get more orchestration analysis from me. So, just kind of looking at certain functions here, it's scored nearly the same. Dun 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 dun, except like right here, you have your English horn joining up with the horns to play a contrary motion, which is very, very fun, along with the violas. And I think that's just a wonderful touch in there. And then, as for the overall scoring of the chord, you're adding piccolo on top. You got the 2 flutes, and they're doubling this wonderful interpretation of the harmony right in here. The oboes sort of interlocking with the flutes. You've already got a lot of, you're going to have a lot of weight on that E, just with the first clarinet. That is going to provide enough punch to that E. So, like, if it's better to have A2 flutes on the B and to have this E just played by the first clarinet, written F sharp. That would be a more balanced way of scoring this, because, like, here you're just doubling up the clarinet part with the flute in a sort of weaker area, right? So, like, for fortissimo, you just really want the flute in its brightest, most powerful, punchy area in this kind of scoring, especially with the horns right below, even marked down a one dynamic range, one dynamic, dynamic level. So yeah, so intriguing, lovely, very very vibrant. Just I'm running out of my adjectives. I have to look deeper in my bag of adjectives to describe the impact here. It's very very good. So the next issue here is melodic development soaring quite high to the uppermost orchestral register. At the same time that we have to think about how the accompaniment figures are being handled, right? So, okay, and you have added a second element here, which is like a kind of a contrapuntal, it's kind of like a imitating line coming in a little late, and that's all very very fun. Okay, but the thing about it is, it kind of weakens this, right? So I feel really strongly that like the accompaniment just really sounds weak in here because it's scored onto harp, so you don't really hear it in the mock-up. And you've got all these other things happening, the horns going dun 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 and so on. So and some of the notes of the accompaniment are covered here, like this sounding B, right? So I mean, stopped high sounding or written F sharp, right, is going to blast out this octave for the harp. So it's really better to have this interpreted as pizzicato. And if you did that, I would say just have some kind of doubling in there for your pizzicato strings, right? And then that would take care of that. And then right in here, like we have the similar problem, once again, of, you have the ya-da-da-da, kind of imitation from below, which is cool. But then we have kind of, since this is in the harp, it's very weak, right? And you have some elements in the horn once again. So I would say, look, you've got your first violin's free. Maybe they could be interpreting some of that pizzicato or something, and with some doubling by clarinet or English horn. So as to the melodic development, I think you get it spot on right here at the beginning, just running up to this A and then letting the piccolo take over. I think that this works beautifully. And having the first violin come in and double this and lead into these down bows. So this is all great. So notice that there are no grace notes here, everybody. So a lot of people put in like down bows, like a row of down bows, but had grace notes at the same time, which is kind of problematic. The thing that I would say here, Ed, is that you need to turn this from accents into tenutos. That's a more typical. That's a more implied articulation style, right? Because the accent is a punch at the beginning, and then the rest of the shape of the note is a little bit lower, right? But with this bowing strategy, it's like a zoom. You're going zoom, 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 zoom. So it really is a tenuto articulation style rather than a like this is just more like regular bowing. So I would say replace those accents with tenuto marks, and you've got the right style there. Okay, so the melody and added counter melody here, that's all great. So now looking at the treatment of the melody here, you've got A2 flutes above. Yeah, this is all right. And that's good, but I mean, here's my problem, okay? And that is, I feel you're giving the game away here, right? What are we doing with this entire phrase? We end up rushing up to this incredibly high E, right? It's just everything is focused towards running all the way up to, just the highest E possible. And you've already played it here in the F and the G too, right? So where's the thrill, right? You've given it away here. However, if you drop the piccolo down an octave, it can support, it can double up this line, triple up this line if it's A2, on flutes, and then you can rush forward with this, right? And there's no need for the oboe to drop out here. The oboe could just rush up to this E as well, right? And yeah, I mean, it feels a little underpowered with only one voice here in the strings. You could have had your first violins start an octave higher and then drop down after the A to an octave lower. Or you could have had your first violins doubling the flute and piccolo lines and going all the way up to a screaming high E. It's a little screechy, but still, And then you could have had your seconds take over on the lower octave, right? And just had a lot firmer, a lot more, like if you have the snare drum kind of pacing things along below, I think you need more string power here, right? Because like the kind of white noise quality of the snare drum tends to sort of absorb the richness of the strings. So I think you just need more presence here on the strings, more involvement. So here I'm gonna. I think that like when we get to this point, if this is scored the same way that the entire first 16 bars has been, then it feels relentless, right? But it doesn't feel relentless, okay? So that is fine because you have this different kind of scoring right in here. It's just essentially kind of chorale sort of scoring, and it's focused in a different way. However, any chance of like bringing down the ceiling, right? Rather than having the piccolo just blasting away here at the top E, couldn't they just drop down an octave? Because what does Falla do in the piano score? He rushes up to very, very high E, and then he drops down an octave. Because this is the end of this rhythmic phrase, and this is the beginning of the next rhythmic phrase, right? What does he want here? He wants 2, 3, 1, 2 and 3 and 1, 2 and 3 and 1, 2 and 3 and, etc., right? And he wants this to end, right? And this is the end. He doesn't want you to go, he wants you to go, right? So I think that having the piccolo really high here and really high here, is, it takes away from the general meaning, the general arc of how the phrases are working. Then you have one last problem, okay, and that is right here. You have just a single flute, without any kind of support, doubling, or anything, and it is carrying the tune from right here. And did you notice in the mock-up, you could just really barely hear it, right? And the reason for that is the horn. Right? It is pure and simple, is this horn. Its overtones are basically interfering with the flute. So I would say, there's a couple of different fixes. Change this to a bass clarinet part, or bring everything down to piano, right? Just, bum, 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 and then soft accompaniment, da 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 da, and just leave your flute nice and loud, right? Because it will actually get weaker the lower it gets, and the more it has to deal with this kind of richer lower wind and horn scoring. Now, of course, you could say one solo, right, and that will help things out in practice in a live situation, but still, right. And this is really fun, the way that you bring in your first clarinet taking over on the first flute part and so on. I think that works great. So yes, and I can see this leading somewhere, right? Maintaining a driving staccato, transitioning smoothly to the next passage. Well, we don't know what the next passage would be like if you were to score it, but I can imagine, like you would maybe go forwards and then trade off to the strings or maybe the horn or trumpet taking over on the melody and so on. So yeah, so I felt that this was a nice, strong entry, and really is kind of picking up my spirits. I've been working on these evaluations now for 8 weeks or 10 weeks, and it's just lovely to just to see the momentum kind of growing. I'm just getting so excited as I'm getting close to the end, and not because I'm happy for it to be over, but just because approaching the sense of completion, and this is my last chance to share my thoughts with over 100 orchestrators, almost, well, one and two thirds hundreds of, it's like 1 2/3 100 orchestrators, 166 orchestrators, plus me as 167. So it's just so exciting. So, I'm just really feeling it. So thank you so much, Ed, for a real great entry. On to the next one. Ah, this is so inventive, Michele. It's it's just really a delight. It's so unexpected, and there are touches of the cinematic. There are a lot of really, really fun things in here. Um, so so let's talk a little bit about the the harp part right in here. Okay. So, what I recommend here is that since you're like sforzando accent, you do not add a dynamic. So, pretty much everybody will be playing fortissimo right here. So, this will all be interpreted as fortissimo. There is no way that the harp can compete here unless it is playing a huge roll or even a glissando, right? You have a bit of a glissando here with your xylophone. So, why can't you have a glissando with your harp as well? Or you could just have a really big hand over hand roll, just really covering maybe 3 octaves of range, like having the left hand start below and then the right hand play in the middle of the chord and then the left hand finish at the top, right? Just some big bum 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 and then just have the right hand continue fortissimo, not mezzo forte. Everybody else can play mezzo forte, but the harp it absolutely must play fortissimo here in order to be heard. I would say that the whole, the finessing of the like the staccato marks here is, I mean, that makes the harp less generous, but you want a more generous sound here with your harp. You don't want staccato. And I think the accents are kind of immaterial. Just mark it fortissimo and just let the harpist play. And then continue the harpist at a nice loud dynamic here. It should be forte espressivo. Don't go down to mezzo piano here. You must keep it loud, or else it is just really going to die away. It's going to be, right here at the beginning, it will be absorbed by what's going on in the strings, and then it will just sort of die off feebly. Right, because you have all of these other elements going on. So the only strategy here that will make the harp work will be forte, and I think you should start with another big roll, like bum 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 bum. Okay, and now you've got how many kettles do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you've got 5 pitches. You could probably have the lowest 2 pitches covered by 1 kettle, just changing from E to F and so on. So that's a very easy change, especially with pedals that have little levers on them, little tuning levers. And then this B can be changed to a C later on and so on. So, or the D could be changed to a C, but then you have a D here, right? So F, G, F. So yeah, you're asking for a lot of different pitches. So if you're going to ask for so many pitches anyway, can't you play bum 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 bum, right? Bum 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 bum. Can maybe do 4 pitches in here and just sort of just bonk? Because I feel that this is almost a letdown. You go brium 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 bonk, right? It's just you know what it reminds me of. It's like, when everybody is sort of like doing their they're like you have like a series of actors in a play, and they're each doing their doing like maybe a little bit of singing or a little bit of dancing, or maybe they're orating, they're saying these famous quotes, and then they shift to the one actor who isn't prepared, and they're like, what? And then then things go on. So I mean, if you want that element of fun, then that's cool. But I think that if you've got so many different pitches set up on your timpani, couldn't you work out a sort of a tuning where you go bum 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 bum? It doesn't even have to be over these same four melodic pitches. It doesn't have to go C B A C, right? It could just go bum 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 bum. Just imply a pitch set, right? Okay, so that is kind of my impression about the harp. And then here, this glissando is fine. It's exactly the way to do it, except we need a pedal diagram to tell us, right? And you can set all that up with the harp pedal plugin. So that's, I think you have to ask for it. I don't think it's built into the system, but yeah, you know, just add harp pedaling, right? So get that plugin. I've explained it in other evaluations, but you just select the first and the last pitch, and then you just sort of fill in the information of what kind of tuning you want, and then you can ask for it to leave a diagram, and that's what the harpist really needs, is that diagram, the tuning diagram. And then here, just like I was saying in Ed's evaluation just a minute ago, you do not need an upward pointing arrow on a standard default roll. It should always be a standard default roll line without the arrow, because we know that it means roll upwards. That is the default, so we don't need the arrow. When you put the arrow in, you are implying that somewhere in this piece it goes downhill. So this one's up, that next one's going to be down maybe, you might have two downs and then an up and so on. So as soon as you throw in this arrow, the player will look over their part and they'll say, well, where's the down arrow? And they'll keep looking, and they'll just find a bunch of up arrows, and they'll just kind of shake their head and go, okay, all right, I see what they're doing. All right, fine. But, you know, you just save let's not, we are the orchestrators of the future here, some of us. Or I would say, like, we are some of the orchestrators of the future. There are people who aren't in the community who are also going to be orchestrating in the future. So we can draw this line in the sand and say, by golly, if it's a default upward roll, it should just be a line and not an arrow. Okay, so please stop putting in arrows when it's the default upward roll, right? And there is no downward arrow to contrast. That's my advice. Okay. And then, here you've got this, let vibrate, right? The unfinished tie. Just score in how long you want it to last, right? You don't need to do this. Just, bring, and just, tie it to dotted half note or whatever, right? And just let that be what it is. Now, however, like, if you have trumpets, horns, very, very healthy winds right in here, and strings, mezzo forte is not going to cut it. No way, no how. This has to be marked like fortissimo, right? Just leave the fortissimo there, or otherwise this roll is not going to come through. Okay, so that's my lecture on harp for this. Now, let's talk about the actual scoring, okay? So, the first concern, pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano, that can be set aside because you have a big, full sound picture. Thematic material, repeating often, possibly sounding repetitive if orchestrated the same exact way throughout, that is not a concern because you change things quite a bit, right? Like these two pairs of bars are more or less the same. But then here, you start to alter things. It's already different from what happened before. And then you get really, really soft. Almost, just kind of almost like you're sort of making a slight joke out of it, which is, I think, is fun. So that's all good. So as far as the orchestration of this is concerned, you have your flutes rushing up to this B and so on. You have the oboes playing the mediant of the chord. You have the clarinets playing the B and the E below, sounding B and E below. And then we've got divisi violins. Would it be possible just to make things stronger? What if these pitches? What if you had the E slurring upwards to the B, and then these Bs were played by the viola, and then this B right in here, or sorry, then this C right in here, would just be up one step from the B on the first line above the alto clef, right? Alto staff. So. It just might be an easier way of organizing this rather than splitting up your violins, right? So because these are going to be fairly powerful instruments in here. Even though you have everybody playing mezzo forte, you want the feeling of, you want the more present kind of sound. You want a richer sound. Okay, and then right in here. It's a similar kind of scoring, except you're sort of taking away the function of the clarinet, right, and giving this part right in here to the second flute. And since you sort of are dropping the volume a little bit and just making it more about the winds and so on, and a little bit of trumpet in there. Here's the danger about this, and that is that your solo trumpet is going to be so loud that the flute player you might as well just go home, right? There is no way that you can bring down the volume and say, oh, well, I'll make the trumpet part mezzo forte so it won't drown out the flute, because there's no way to play this mezzo forte up there. This is a forte note, this high B, right? And especially you put an accent on it, it's going to sound almost fortissimo. So my recommendation here would be to figure out some way that you could harmonize from below on this with your winds, because like both the low piccolo and the flute right on these B's is just going to be blasted out of the water. Just like throwing, like, say you have a little toy boat in your bathtub, and then you like jump into the bathtub and do a cannonball dive. What's going to happen to that boat? That's what's going to happen to your piccolo and your flute. It's going to be so overwhelmed here by the sound of the trumpet. So, maybe it would be a better strategy to have some of this harmonization come from the other trumpets, right? If you have 3 trumpets and you have horns in here, maybe they could be taking over some of the functions here, and you could just leave the winds out completely, right? So, or have the strings come in and sort of play under the trumpet a little bit. All right. And then, of course, we already talked about this here, the rolled harp, and, could you possibly go boom, 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 boom with your timpani? But yeah, that's all very cool right in there. Yeah, I like the way this kind of dies down a little bit. So, now our next problem is... our next 2 criteria are melodic development soars quite high, accompaniment figures cover a wide range, and so on. So everybody has heard these now a zillion times, so I'm not going to go into them too much. These Bs are perfectly playable by the violas, right? So, in fact, like your scoring for the viola is so high, just in general, that... you might as well just put a treble clef here, right? And you could bring back your alto clef, say like maybe right around here or here, just depending on, or maybe here. But yeah, I just think like you could give this pizzicato note here to your violas, and then you could have this line continue on in the second violins, and then it wouldn't be so weak compared to, like, whenever you divide up the strings, they're kind of half as strong, right? And it's not a big issue unless you are sort of playing in a thicker texture like this. Now, you have scored like mezzo piano, crescendo to mezzo forte. We'll talk about that in a minute. And, mezzo piano, brass, and then diminuendo to pianissimo, and the trumpets and so on. Okay. All right, but that still is a lot of warmth. It's a lot of tone. It's a lot of sound that is going to absorb some of what's going on in the violins, right? So it would be better for this B on pizzicato to be given to the viola, and for this lower line here, this lower divisi line, to be a second violin line. And then you can just end here, arco, on the B. It makes perfect sense, right? Now, you were going all the way up to this high E, and that, or excuse me, this high D, and that's perfectly fine. And in here, you're going all the way up to E. So, like, as long as you are aware that that is kind of a squeaky register for the violin. I mean, it's perfectly possible. There is nothing wrong with going up that high for a professional violinist. It's just a very, very short length of string, right? It's just a few inches long, as opposed to, around a foot long or so. On the kind of the average note is like maybe 8 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches, 9 inches long. But, here, like, we're getting down to like 2 or 3 inches, right? So it's very, very squeaky and high. So, like, doubling it with piccolo, that helps a lot. And I like the way that you have divided it. But one thing that you should try to do is try to dovetail wherever you can, right? Here you have A2 flutes, right? Could one of your flute players gone up to G and then drop down to F, right? Down to a lower F, or could there be some dovetailing note here somewhere? And the same thing here, right? Rather than just dropping, because like when you drop, you create a break in the integrity of the line, right? So we can, and in some of these entries, you've seen everybody dropping down a seventh, right? And so you can really, really hear that drop. So try to keep that to a minimum. Try to dovetail as much as possible. Like you could have your piccolo player come in a couple beats early, and then and then just play off of the top of this line as it goes up, and you won't hear it. You won't hear the seam so much. Okay. But as far as this is concerned, I love the idea of the oboes working in harmony. I love them, the way that they are playing right under the flutes and the octaves and the violins. I think that that's all very, very cool and very, very strong. Okay, but the problem with this interpretation is that this this little pizzicato thing right in here, which is the original accompaniment figure, it's very weak compared to what's going on in the horns and the bassoons, right? So the beautiful richness here, you can market mezzo piano all you like, but the beautiful richness in here will overwhelm. I mean, it is overwhelming it in the mock-up, right? You can barely hear this boop, 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 right? I mean, could you spare somebody? Could somebody be spared to double these poor violas in here? Could they be played arco, accented, so that we can hear the line a little bit better? Now here, you're saying pizzicato, pluck, pluck, and then let this sort of hang. Just write exactly the length you want there. This is completely unnecessary, okay? If you want this to last for a dotted quarter note or a half note, just write in a dotted half note or a quarter note. Don't write, I think that this can get to be a little too much, the sort of let it hang kind of incomplete tie. It's, for this style of concert music, it just feels out of place, all right? Just write in the length you want, and they will play that length, and don't worry about it. And it's the same thing with the harp right in here, right? Just whatever the length you intend this to be, write that in, and the harpist will play that length. I would hold off on the incomplete tie unless you are having, like, say, maybe a cymbal hit. Like you have a cymbal hit, and then you have the incomplete tie. And then what I like to do with my incomplete tie, instead of having this sort of tiny little addition to the note, I like to have it last for the whole, just going all the way to the end of the bar. I mean, I want it to be visible, because sometimes these things get overlooked in the just sort of the heat of sight reading because they're so small, right? Especially on like just a single note like this. It might be mistaken for an accent or anything, right? So just write the value that you want and leave the incomplete ties to like percussion instruments or something. Okay. So now here we have the mirror of this section right in here, and you have sort of mirrored a lot of the arranging as well. And we're starting off with doubled clarinets an octave below the violins. And that's a very cool idea, by the way, because you get this very nautical sound. It sort of sounds a little bit like a sailor's hornpipe below, right? And then you have that's supporting the violins above, but it isn't reinforcing the fundamental, right? The body of tone of the violin is what gets reinforced by the more complex overtones of the clarinet. So that's a very cool sound. And then you have everybody come in here. Yeah, and nice doubling going all the way to the top there. Piccolo and first violins, and then here you have the flutes and the second violins, and so on, other instruments joining in. I love this little harmony right in here. Why can't this harmony be expressed by our clarinets? Right? I mean, here we have this is an F third, right? So that would be sounding a written G third in the clarinet. So why can't you've got two clarinetists? Can you spare one? And that way we can reinforce this harmony here. All right, and then I love that you rush up to the E and then you drop down immediately. The only problem here is that you're giving both of your flutes this harmony part in the middle, and this piccolo here is in a weaker register, not really weak, but just not as strong register, and it's intended to be the only support available whatsoever for the first violins. So I think this line here should be second flute, and then this should be doubled by first flute above, right? You have some harmony scoring and so on in certain parts, but dare to add parts and score more fully for your wins, and I think your scoring will just be beautifully rich. Yeah. And make this an emphatic accent. Don't slur into it. Da pow, not da. Because what is it when you put an accent at the end of a slur? It's like somebody coughing at the end of talking a blue streak. Like I'm running out of breath. Right? So you can't really get much of a punch here. But if you let it come to an end, then you can go pow with the embouchure. And the same thing here. You can really hit this hard. Why is this not accented and this is accented? Right? Shouldn't they have the same articulation style? So end this slur here, right? Or you could go da, like down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. That's how I would score this. And you can still do the slur to here, but that might be better to do the slur here and then have this individually articulated as well. Or you could have them all accented, right? Because if you look at the score, there's nothing implying a slur right in there at all, right? It's interesting that you're bringing down the volume of the winds, and but you still have your violin very loud here. I think you should try to go for a more unified dynamic here. I think everybody could be forte except for the brass. Keep the brass down at mezzo forte, crescendo to forte, right? I don't think your winds need to be below the volume below the dynamic of the first violins. Just put in some doubling here on the first flute on those E's. So you have first flute, piccolo, and first violins playing those E's, and then the second flute doubling the second violins, and then I think this will work a whole lot better. The other thing too is that I would not trust piccolo to be the doubling here. It's too weak. You're heading down into areas where it sounds like a folk flute, right? And you're pushing it up to fortissimo. Once again, you have two flute players here. Can't the first flute player be doubling this line? Or maybe just don't even bother with the piccolo once you get to this E. Just continue on with just first flute and then this second flute below, right? Have the first flute take this over and double right in here. And then it's a much firmer line, but it's just, yeah, just like this isn't really offering a lot of support. And the other thing is like, what kind of bowing do you want here? So down, up, down, up, down, up, down, right? So, but I feel that really it should be more like this: down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. So make these slurs shorter, right? Right. I think you need to hit the end of your rhythmic phrase, right? Your rhythmic phrases are 2 and 3 and 1, 2 and 3 and 1. So you need to hit the end of that phrase, hit the 1 nice and hard, right? And indeed, there is an accent on these notes, right, in other parts and in the score, so in the piano score. So I think you should restore that to the melody. Here, you're climbing quite high with your brass from below, and that is further weakening the power of the violin part right in here. There's all the more reason why the piccolo can't be trusted to be the support. Now we're getting to this part, and it's really cool the way that you're trading off between flute, and then you've got oboe here, and then you go to flute again, and the flute is incapable here because the strings are not soft enough. If the strings had gone down to piano here, then the flute could accompany more powerfully. But the flute is too weak here. First flute and then second flute. It would have been better if the first clarinet took over this part. You would get that kind of, boop 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 boop. You would get that same kind of feel right in there. But yeah, I just don't feel that flute is strong enough right in here, especially when you have lower strings doubling the being doubled by the bassoons right in here. That's just so much more powerful than flute in the first octave. I think you should try to match slurring styles with bowing styles, right? If you're gonna go, da 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 da, then you should have the same thing going on in your winds. But I mean, do you want it to be that paced, right? Do you want this to be slurred? In my evaluation criteria, I think I put a value on maintaining a driving staccato there, right? Yup, up, 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 up. I've had the sort of metaphor of a runaway child, right? And they're not paced; they're just running for it. They are just heading down that street, and their mother's running after them, trying to catch them before they go into traffic, right? So we sort of lose that quality a little bit when everything is sort of da 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 da, as opposed to yet da 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 da. Do you see what I mean? And then here you're also like softening things to piano because you want to bring everything to an end. But like, what does it say in the piano score? Actually, it says crescendo, and then I put in a little dashed diminuendo because that's what most pianists do. They pull back a little so that they can set up a new dynamic for the next phrase. So anyway, yeah, I mean, a very cool, diverting score. Very, very fun to look over. I hope that some of these suggestions might prove useful, Michele. I mean, it really is like my suggestions are not trying to get you to orchestrate things according to my vision. I'm trying to take your vision here and see what I can do to make it stronger and stronger, right? I feel that that's the best, to see what is the original conception and how can it be even more strongly realized, right? So that is my only motive here. So, and I think there are just so many fun ideas in here that if there's anything that I said that's useful and would make you score this way even stronger, then that would be great. But I would just say, like, watch out for things like this, kind of having a background pad, kind of sucking out a little bit of the energy, like kind of suppressing the vitality of the accompaniment style while you have this sort of pad in the background just kind of pulling back at the momentum. Things like that. But just maybe more practical ways of interpreting some of these making the string parts a little fuller and so on, rather than sacrificing a whole group of instruments just to play one B when they could be taking over this and making it really lush. Just little things like that, right? So anyways, great score. Really, really enjoyed it. And, sorry that you've had to wait so long, but, for your evaluation. But I really do appreciate, your comments and likes and other interaction with some of the other entrants on the way to this point. So thank you so much for that. And now on to the very last evaluation for this group of scores. Okay, Karina, that is a really lovely, almost celeste concerto kind of interpretation of this work. And let's talk about a few basics, okay? So here at the beginning, you're saying oboe d'amore and clarinet in B flat, right? So that implies that there is only one instrument on each part. So you're saying clarinet, not clarinets. You're saying oboe d'amore, not oboes d'amore. And yet here you have intervals, right? So the individual wind instruments cannot play intervals. So this implies that there are two instruments playing on each of these staves, right? So two oboes d'amore, two clarinets. And if that's the case, then what is happening to the second player? Are you playing with two players? Or is this two clarinet players and then changing to one on each part? Do you see the problem that you are presenting here by throwing in intervals? And here you say horn in F, and then you are writing in two parts to your horn part, right? To your one horn part. A similar situation, trombone, right? We have a trombone, and you are giving the trombone player two notes at once. Now, it's a very spare score. You don't really have a whole lot going on, so there is no reason why you couldn't make this a bigger score and you could add flute, you could add bassoon, you could have two horns instead of one. You could have two trombones instead of one trombone, and then that would give you the extra players that you need. Now, the thing here is that I would not actually score. I would not actually score two oboes d'amore, right? I would just have one oboe d'amore and one a flute or some other instrument to double it with, because I don't really feel that it's, it's a beautiful instrument, but I don't feel that you have totally justified its use here, right? It's most of your interest here in the scoring is really about the celesta, right? The celesta is really taking over the it's playing at all the most interesting parts. So I'm not really seeing an oboe d'amore solo that really stands out on its own. It's always being accompanied by the celesta, right? So we're not really hearing the d'amore part really kind of stand out at all. And then right in here, like it's doubling the violin as well. So it's kind of a further argument against even using the oboe d'amore at all, unless you yourself are a player, or there is somebody who you work with a lot who is a player and you want to give them more chances to play. So that would be a different thing. But I would say it'll make it a lot more attractive for your piece if you were to score this just for a standard oboe. And I think that the parts wouldn't sound all that differently. What if you had a lineup of flute, oboe, which could also be oboe d'amore, could be on an alternate part, clarinet, and bassoon, and then you were to work, any extra pitches, any kind of reinforcement, and so on could be doled out across those four instruments. Now, one last thing here, like you're throwing in some low celesta here, in a place where it will be doubled by the viola, and you kind of notice in the mock-up that you really can't hear the celesta, and that is true because celesta is a very soft instrument. You're having it play alongside these other much more powerful instruments, and especially alongside timpani. And the honest truth is the celesta is a very, very soft instrument. Its maximum volume in the orchestra is about mezzo piano. And then its minimum volume, it actually does not get to be incredibly soft. It's just a little bit above pianissimo, right? It's just like poco piano. It's just a little bit softer than piano, but not quite all the way down to a beautiful pianissimo. So the celesta has just a very limited range of how loud or soft it can play. That doesn't mean that you should market mezzo piano as its highest dynamic, but you should still market forte because that's all about the force that the player is using to play with. But this forte is not going to be louder than anybody else's forte or as loud. It will really be at the most as loud as sort of mezzo piano. And then the other problem too is that you can't really get a good staccato on a celesta, right? It kind of implies, I mean, yeah, you can play staccato on celesta, but like the way that your mock-up is sounding, it sounds like the celesta player has the pedal down, right? So if you really want that kind of very sustained bell-like sound for your celesta part, then the staccato is meaningless, right? So yeah, you can play celesta staccato, but you cannot mark the staccato if what you intend is that beautiful, dreamy kind of playing with the sustain pedal. Now, all of these ottava marks are completely unnecessary. Just like any good pianist can read up to high D, the celesta player can read up to high D. They do not need this. The same is true here. There's absolutely no need for the celesta player to have an ottava over this part. And then right in here you have all of the staccato playing. And, I mean, staccato celesta would actually sound good, right? But once again, you can hear that it's very, very dreamy sounding the way that the celesta is played in the mock-up. So it's just a question of whether or not that has, and also it'll be drowned out by the power of the clarinet and the oboe d'amore, right? They will just really interfere with the sound in there. All right, so let's jump back to the beginning. So I think this is a really fun, like, chamber music kind of arrangement of the score. A couple things I think you should try to aim for. Have two violin parts. Here you just have violin, viola, cello, and double bass. You should have two violin parts, and the violin parts should work together. You should demand from yourself the imagination that it requires to score both of those parts. You should bring those parts in more frequently. You should avoid writing in down bows and up bows. That is the responsibility of the concertmaster and the section principals. For violas and cellos and so on, they are the ones who decide what will go up bow and down bow. That is not for us to decide. And here, like, it kind of doesn't mean anything. You say pizzicato, and then you have up bow and down bow. So that doesn't relate, right? We don't need up bow and down bow if we're just plucking, right? That there's no meaning to the up bow and down bow sign when there's a pizzicato scored, right? Yeah. Yeah, so you can just throw away all of these signs. They won't be relevant. All right. So let's assume that this isn't solo instruments. That this isn't a violin player, a viola player, one cello player. That this is a string section that, this is intended to be orchestral rather than a chamber group, right? So let's judge it on those terms. So our first concern in the evaluation criteria is to not have pitches that are limited to the first, to the first 2 octaves above middle C, middle C up to C, 2 Cs above middle C, which is the way that the pitches are limited to in the for the piano score, upper middle register of the orchestra. Okay, and your sound picture is larger than that, and that's very, very good. I really like that a lot, that you just have a bigger sound picture. You aren't limiting yourself to what's in the piano score. The next concern is, since the piano score sort of repeats the first 2 bars over and over again, it sort of has these first 2 bars scored exactly the same way and then nearly exactly the same way again. Is that something to be avoided? I feel it is. I feel that it's better to progress the texture to, for the first 4 bars to be impressive, and then the next time that this section repeats, which is right here, that it should be more committed, or it should just change in some way that is interesting and pulls the listener forwards. And you pretty much do that, right? So you address that particular question. So let's talk about the orchestration that you've used here. Okay, so the there's no problem with the oboe d'amore part. That is being scored an octave above the violin, and you've got the and the viola playing the same thing an octave lower. You've got the clarinet taking the mediant, the major third, brum 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 brum, or brum 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 brum. Okay, but now here's where we're getting into problems. You have the horn slurring down from a high B to F sharp. And then you were throwing in a high C and a G. So it's not that this isn't playable, it just isn't, it's just really demanding for, you're asking a lot of your horn player and not really giving them much in return. Do you know what I mean? It's a question of, will the effort that it requires to play this how you have scored it result in a very good sounding horn part? I don't think it will. When the higher you get on a horn, the more you sort of have to slur up rather than down. So that's one issue. And why do we need this high B to slur down anyways? Why do we need that sounding E slurring down? Couldn't we have, like, for instance, this is a little meaningless. Like you're having the oboe d'amore part tie on a grace note, right? So why can't this be the low E? Bum 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 bum. Because like all you're asking the oboe d'amore player right here to do is to come in a beat early, right? So da 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 da, as opposed to like working more organically. So I would say give this note to your oboe d'amore player and don't worry about the B grace note, right? So that would be the first thing. So if you get rid of the grace note, then immediately it simplifies the part. Except for the fact that you just throw in this high C here like it was nothing, right? So I would say try to avoid that. So like the high C for a horn is a really easily playable note on trumpet. C trumpet, it's just a sounding F, right? But here it's like one of the hardest notes to play on horn, and it's just kind of thrown in there as if it were easy to play, but it isn't, right? It not only is it not easy to play, it will be so powerful that it'll be hard to hear other people playing, right? So like, you want, you just want this F to be part of the harmony, right? But it is so huge that it is going to unbalance the harmony in your other wind parts. So I think you need to rethink the role of the horn here. I don't have any problem with a F F F with if you take the grace note out. I mean, that is playable with really, really good horn players, but it's still it's kind of awkward. It would be better to take this sounding E and slur up to this note and get rid of the tied grace note, right? So that's a way of solving that problem. There just has to be some other way for you to score this. Some other instrument could play this F. You could add instruments, you could throw in a trumpet part on that, but just avoid sending your horn player up to top C when there are other instruments that could play the top C, right? Just, the sounding F. Okay, and then this is kind of fun. Once again, I think that Celesta adds almost nothing here in terms of it. Like it just is overwhelmed. And then here, this is fun. I mean, I don't have any problem with this horn part in here. Bum 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 bum. Except like, once again, playing at the top of the staff for the horn, it's a very loud register for that instrument, and you have the celesta coming in. So the celesta is going to be overwhelmed by the sound of the horns and the trombones, and then continuing on, as it does, it will also be at a disadvantage with the oboe d'amore and the clarinet an octave lower, right? These instruments will tend to outplay the celesta as you've scored it right in there. All right, now let's jump ahead. We're going to come back to this section in a minute. Now here, we have some of the same problems, but if you could fix these problems, it's actually not scored all that. There aren't that many problems. You're giving the melody more to the violin and the viola and so on. Like this would be so good if you had a second violin part in here, right? We need two violin parts. So I mean, you just have to accept that you will have an enormous amount of weight on the lower, sounding B, like an octave lower than the violin, and that weight may actually, the overtones from that, may actually overwhelm the violin above, right? And dun 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 dun. Once again, fortissimo with everybody, including the clarinet especially, and then horns hitting this really hard. The celesta just has no chance right in here with this texture, even in a more chamber kind of an arrangement. It's interesting that you're putting the mediant, the major third, on the bottom. That doesn't. There's no problem with it, but I mean, it's interesting that you throw in the root with the. It's actually not the root; it's the fifth. You throw in the fifth with the timpani. Bum 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 bum, bum 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 bum. Yeah. All right. So let's jump back here. Our next two concerns are melodic development soaring quite high, the accompaniment figures covering a wide range of pitches. If you were to score them in wind instruments, you don't. That's fine. You just use pizzicato. I would try to keep the same pattern. Like here you're kind of reversing it. It should go, bum, 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 bum. And here you're going bum, 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 bum. So maybe there's a different way of scoring this. Just go back down to the low E, I think would be good right in there. I don't think it would hurt anything. All right. I like that little push there at the end. So the accompaniment pattern is fine. Melodic development soaring quite high. Since you're keeping your oboe d'amore part down, it's no problem for it to play up to this high F, but that high F is going to be very thin. Okay, so that's the trade-off. So, I mean, that is about as high as I would want to send my d'amore part, because it's more of a middle register instrument, right? So you're not really getting the best out of it. You're kind of getting this very high piping sound. That's the, as thin as the oboe gets, the oboe d'amore, I feel, gets even thinner going up to that high register. It does not have. There's a certain sweet innocence about going way high like that, but yeah, it's still. And then here you have the doubling, right? and then suddenly you drop with the clarinet. So, and then the celesta. So, is there anything wrong with a clarinet playing an octave below and sort of not? So, like, the thing is, it's here you have a very audible oboe d'amore part, right? And then here you are confusing the issue by doubling at pitch with the clarinet. Now it's harder to hear the oboe d'amore, and then suddenly the d'amore player has to be all on their own as the clarinet drops. What if the clarinet player just came in an octave lower all the time, right? And then you'd have the celesta above, the d'amore in the middle, and the clarinet below throughout. And I think that would actually help the sound. That would help the celesta part be a lot clearer. All right, now we are jumping ahead to the mirror of that B section right in here. Once again, oboe d'amore is taking over, and we've got the, dun 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 dun. These should just be quarter notes, right? So eighth quarter, dun 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 dun, pyam. Yeah, and yeah, like so. So here, Karina, I think the strongest advice that I could give you is, next time you take on a score like this, try to do it without adding any harp, no celesta, no piano, no keyboard instrument of any kind whatsoever. Just completely score onto orchestral instruments, and then when you do, keep your scoring on standard string groups, right? So rather than having this, violin, viola, cello, double bass, have two violins, first and second violin, viola, cello, double bass, and really, like this scoring that you have right in here for violas, this is more of a second violin part, right? Doubling the firsts, and just sort of taking some of the advantage of some of the lower pitches, right? It is really more of that part than it is a viola part. Viola part would be more like supporting what's going on in the cellos and maybe the trombones, or working together with the horns and so on, the horns and the cellos. So, all right, so yeah. So here you don't want to send your oboe d'amore all the way up to a high G, right? A high sound or high written G. So yeah, it does make sense the way that you've scored this. Just so long as, I don't understand why you're leaving out the finishing note though. G. So I don't understand why the G is missing here. And then here, like once again, you have two parts, right? So who is this second person right in here, right? You have to decide. Would that be like second clarinet? Would the top part be flute and the bottom part be oboe d'amore? Now, in this relationship here between the clarinet and the horn, the horn will outplay the clarinet quite considerably, right? And they're both doubling the viola, right? So I would say, rather than having this strange mixture of different volume levels, of different dynamic levels, it would be better to have, I would say, forte throughout, right? So forte, forte, forte on all the strings, and then on the horn mezzo forte, and then you'll get a balance that doesn't outplay the violas and the clarinets working together. All right. Da 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 ba ba bum ba bum ba ba bum ba bum bum ba bum bum. Yeah, it's all kind of fun the way this works together. I see it would be so much more powerful if you had second violins in there, right? Doubling the violins, playing these lower pitches, maybe playing at octaves when you get to this point. So much that you could do with a good second violin group. And then, of course, right in here, the cellos are inaudible, like with the horns and trombones working together. See, here it seems as if you have a quartet of brass, right? You have two horns, two trombones, and so on. So you need to work out how many you have, and don't send the horn player up to high C like this. I don't think that it's justified by the scoring here, right? Your your clarinet is descending, your strings are descending, you are starting off on a celesta note, right? And you're playing the highest note on the horn with a little scoop up to the high C. So this would be sounding F once again, right? And it just is going to be so strong. You're not going to be able to really make out the celesta until right around here. And then of course these winds going, yap up 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 really loudly are going to drown out the celesta as well. So this is why I'm saying try not to score keyboard instruments, because I feel like you are using the keyboard instruments almost like, just as a bit of a default, right? Like you're scoring around the keyboard instrument, and rather than using the keyboard instrument, in this case, is decoration, right? The celesta's role in the orchestra is just a decorative element. It shouldn't be like a main element that carries the melody through powerful passages like this, because it doesn't have the strength to, right? And the same thing is true of harp, by the way. But if you were to use a standard piano, then the piano is subtracting from your ability to score things right onto the orchestra without depending on the piano, right? So I would say, really, just try to avoid using a keyboard instrument in your next entry. And I would really strongly encourage you to enter again, because I'm intrigued by this. I think you have some really great ideas here. I think you made a really good start, but perhaps just a little bit more familiarity with the relationships between the instruments, their limitations. Maybe don't choose like such an exotic instrument here. I think that by scoring for oboe d'amore, you immediately make your score, you limit how many people can play it or want to play it, right? Because the oboe d'amore is always like an added expense. It's hard to get a hold of. Sometimes you get a hold of one. The only one in the country, maybe, in some smaller countries, can be a model that is really out of shape, or in which case they have to hire somebody. They have to hire a specialist from overseas or from from some other country to come fly in and play. And so it just becomes one problem stacked on top of another on top of another. So I would say just a few final thoughts in there is to it's just to try to use standard instruments at first, right? As you are building towards things. Like if this entire piece was a big oboe d'amore solo, and there was nothing competing with it, and it was really focused around that d'amore, and you didn't have to deal with like very loud timpani or celesta parts interfering and so on, then I would be totally on board with that. I would say, oh yeah, okay, that's a really great way to do that. But I would still say make sure that there's an alternate part just for standard oboe, because I don't think there's anything you've scored here that wouldn't work on a standard oboe. You probably would even sound better as you're going up to some of those very, very high notes, where we go, like all the way up to this high written F, right? Which on a standard oboe would just be a D, right? So it would be a much, much easier, more playable kind of a thing. Less squeaky, less kind of breathless or gasping up there. Now here you are kind of saying change B to A, then change the A back to a B, and so on. I think that this could be handled by, let's see, A. I think this could be handled by 4 kettles. I don't think you need. So just A, B, E, F, right? So I think that those are all accessible. I'm just trying to think of my, just doing a quick check mentally of that. Yeah, that's all accessible. So you don't need to have the B change to A and the A change to B or anything like that. That's not necessary right in there. Yeah, and it's just you're sort of writing this B. And you don't have any other lower pitches, and I think that, and here you're saying change the F to a G and the G to an F and so on. Why can't you just change this A to a G, right? And then just play the G lower here, and then the B and the F again. I think that would just be simpler, rather than really tuning the top kettle up quite so high. All right, so look, it's really enjoyable, but obviously needs a little bit of work. Avoid the celesta. I would say, like, there are uses for the celesta, but it's kind of like icing, right? Icing on a cake. So like frosting on a cake. The more celesta there is on your cake, the more celesta there is in your score, is the more frosting on your cake. So how much frosting can a cake hold, right? So if it's really all about the celesta. Now, if it's a celesta solo, that's one thing, but then you have to really score the music around it so you don't have elements that are too loud. And it's the same thing with the oboe d'amore. It's got a beautiful sound, and there's something about the oboe d'amore that's kind of cute, kind of cutesy, right? It's sort of like the little angels that you see on a Christmas card, right? Rather than the angels that you see in a painting by a great like a great painter, right? So it's the difference between those two things. It has this sort of really charming quality, but that can sort of wear thin if it's if you rely on it too often to as the main instrument all the time, right? And there's ways around that too, but we'll just turn this evaluation into a huge seminar on that instrument. So anyway, to sort of bring this to a conclusion, I would say that I just really enjoyed looking at this. You did things that were so different and so so much not what I was expecting. But I would say just try to use the ensemble, the orchestral ensemble, to its fullest. Don't leave out anything like second violin or so on and so on. Like, try to score it more fully, and try not to allow keyboard instruments or harp to play a huge role in the way that you score things at first. And then, as you get better at this and have more and more complex scoring, you'll be able to add that with more confidence and it really judiciously at exactly the right moment, and then it won't feel like it's taking over, right? Or that it's pulling down the dynamic or being buried by other instruments, right? All those different dangers. But look, thank you so much for entering this challenge, and Karina, imagine just continue to work on your orchestration, and please enter the next challenge in 2022. Right, which I think will also challenge you to come up with different ways of scoring. And if you were able to score that without using harp, celesta, or any other instrument, that would be really, really awesome. So think about all those things, and thank you so much for your entry. I really enjoyed looking at it, and thanks to all of the 5 orchestrators who contributed in this second to last collection. So I'm really enjoying this. I'm going to have a cup of tea, and then I am going to go evaluate the last 5 scores of our website entrants for the 2021 Orchestration Challenge. See you all really soon.